Greetings and good Thursday evening, the 13th of July, 2023. Still the third decade of the 21st century. If you're new to my channel for any reasons, I always open with that to sort of highlight the fact that if you're not paying attention, it actually is the third decade of the 21st century. And I highlight that to kind of make the point of what sort of things we're talking about, or what sort of things are being talked about, and to kind of emphasize, you do realize it's the third decade of the 21st century and we're talking about this stuff. But I digress. This video is kind of like a, hey, where have I been? What have I been doing? I got a reply from Stace. It was like, hey, where the hell you been? And I was like, I typed a reply, Stace, but as a heads up, I got my second 3D printer. You can't see it, but it's over there printing a Mandalorian helmet. I've been watching a lot of videos on 3D printing as far as how to, manipulate settings and things to expect, and everybody says the same thing. You're going to have failed prints. My God, have I had a lot of failed prints. And I have an 8-foot fluorescent light bulb going to crap. You have any idea how hard it is to find 8-foot fluorescent light bulbs? This house was built in the '65. They don't make 8-foot fluorescent light bulbs anymore, but I digress. So I've been trying to figure out my 3D printer because while I can get a 1 kilogram roll of filament for about 20 bucks, give or take, it's not nice to just throw 20 bucks away. So that's been preoccupying my time. That, and I've had my daughter graduated high school, so we've had a party, family in town. Her birthday was her graduation day, and then it's been kind of like just getting ready for life, like helping her get ready for life after high school, getting her into college. Now that everything has to be done online, you'd be surprised how frustrating it is to get anything done online. It's one thing to handwrite forms. This online stuff, like, oh, you gotta create a thing, and then we've got to confirm you, and that could take days. It's been a pain in the butt. Perhaps anybody out there watching this understands what I'm talking about. But I've been rather busy, and then trying to do yard work in North Carolina on the coast, where it can be a full-on deluge for 20 minutes that completely saturates the ground, and you can't mow wet grass. So today I spent quite a bit of time trying to mow my damn yard, because I had to mow it multiple times on multiple settings because it was so long, and I had a brief period of time where it was dry. So with that being said, another thing I had to do was I had to re-watch my pre and post 9/11 experience video, because I felt as though I could make a part 2 to it, but in order for me to make a part 2, I had to watch it and take notes. And now I kind of understand where actors and actresses come from, because God, was that humiliating. Speaking of which, I'm contemplating whether or not I want to create a second channel for my cosplay, 3D print, nerdy, geeky stuff, and keep this channel more so for like my socio-political everyday commentary. For those that may not be familiar with my channel, one thing I like to do is if I do get comments, I like to read them out loud, react and respond. One of my buddies that I served with, Mikey Pipes, or Mikey the Pipe Boss, I won't give you his real name just in case I don't have his permission, but his response was, war is the best teacher and forces evolution and reevaluation of how one gets things done. Look at World War I. It started with cavalry charges with cavalrymen in bright tunics with the sword in their hand. It ended with tanks and trench warfare where soldiers made homemade horrific weapons useful in tight spaces. Yeah, Mike, you're not entirely wrong. I mean, we did have to adapt to the two different wars. The war in Afghanistan was completely different than the war in Iraq. And for the most part, the war in Iraq was primarily an American-led operation, so there wasn't that much change in some of the things that we did other than having to adapt to the environment, the enemy, which is a normal thing. I say that because going into Afghanistan, which was turned over to NATO prior to the invasion of Iraq. NATO does things completely differently because it's a completely agreed upon standard of all NATO countries. So it has to be a unified standard for NATO. Why we don't train to that standard, period, I don't know. But you had to train separately for the NATO standard in order to go into Afghanistan, which, believe it or not, does kind of run contrary to how we normally did training. As far as that goes, Mike, some of the things that were repetitious, some of the things that I don't want to say made for complacency, but allowed for the opportunity to establish a rhythm, establish a pattern. A lot of those are gone now. When we were younger, we never got a chance to do it, but CAX, Combined Arms Exercise in 29 Palms, California, it's no longer called CAX. I think now they call it ITX. And with that in mind, I did take down some notes to continue the pre and post 9/11 experience. And I'll try to do this in 30 minutes or less. So I highlighted some of the major differences between the pre and post 9/11 war, talking about the hazing and whatnot. Some other things I'd like to talk about, because I made a little list here. Some things I want to try to delineate. Every duty station may have had its own challenges. For those of us in Hawaii, to kind of paint you a picture, between Hawaii and, say, Okinawa or other overseas duty stations where you were separated from, say, mainland United States, you couldn't just jump on a bus or hitch a ride with a buddy, or, you know, a short plane ride home, you know, to maybe go get your car, if you even had a car, and then drive it back to the base. So, like here in North Carolina, you know, the amount of service members, Marines and sailors, and possibly even other bases have this with the Army and the Air Force, but most of the guys I served with here in Camp Lejeune probably grew up within 10 hours of Camp Lejeune. So if they had a car in high school or whatnot, as long as they could somehow get back home, they could go and get their car. Or because they grew up within 10 hours, every little thing we did, Mom and Dad would come down for. We're getting ready to go on deployment. Mom and Dad come out to say goodbye. We come back from a deployment. Mom and Dad come to say, hey, welcome back. They graduate from the School of Infantry. Mom and Dad come out, and it's a big family affair. For me, it was kind of embarrassing, because when we graduated the School of Infantry, I mean, you graduated by yourself. Family was not invited. It was not a family event. You know, it was, you know, grab your shit and go. I mean, God forbid, if you were... We graduated on the West Coast, so if you were in 5th Marines, 1st Marines, or 7th Marines, there was somebody there to pick you up, and it was not friendly. All of us that were leaving, whether it was security forces, Yankee White, Okinawa, Hawaii, we were like, woo! Damn, see ya, wouldn't want to be ya. Because all hell broke loose for all those cats going to 1st Marines in Horno, 7th Marines in 29 Palms, and 5th Marines just up the road in San Mateo. But the vehicles, I noticed, was a big deal. In Hawaii, we hardly had them. You know, you got sent to Hawaii. You showed up at the airport in your service Alphas with a sea bag, a garment bag, and a carry-on bag. And that was pretty much about it. And you got put in the barracks. Cell phones were not a thing back then. Cell phones existed, they just weren't mainstream. They weren't what you would call affordable at that point in time. We also didn't have phone lines in our barracks rooms, or pre-established cable. When I first got to the barracks in Hawaii in 1996, I was delayed a little bit, but we won't get into that. In order for you to get a phone line in your room, you had to get special permission from your chain of command so that the phone company could modify your room to put that phone line in. Same thing with cable. You had to get permission to have the barracks room modified for cable. I think when I came back after my first deployment in 1997, all of a sudden most of the barracks had been renovated with with cable. Um, I don't think the phone lines were installed until after my second deployment in 1998. We came back from deployment in 98, and not only was there cable installed, but then there were phone lines installed. So, you know, during my first enlistment, there were progressive changes to, I guess, increase our comfort in the barracks. Otherwise, the most popular thing to do was like one of those TV VCR combos. It wasn't DVDs back then, and you know, your entire room of 2 to 3 guys would chip on a TV VCR combo, and you'd sit there and watch you'd sit there and watch, you know, VHS tapes, or somebody may have bought a game console back, like Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis or whatnot, and you might play video games. Because I mean, if you weren't of age, you know, you really couldn't go to the bars. You know, not everybody had cars in Hawaii, because apparently we didn't make that much money. So, you know, if you wanted to go out in town, the majority of us used to walk, and I'm talking like 2 to 3 miles to get out the back gate, to go to the bus stop in Kailua, just to get on a bus for like an hour to get to Honolulu to walk around and shop or do whatever. So the vehicles was kind of a big deal. We, at least in my earlier years, a lack of transportation was a big deal. I can't speak for the other bases that were local to the United States, as far as Camp Pendleton, Quantico, Camp Lejeune, 29 Palms, and a couple others. I can't speak for that, but for those of us that got sent overseas, so to speak, like Hawaii, we didn't have vehicles, and you know, vehicles equal freedom, and that was a big deal. As I'm looking at my notes, social media, internet, and cell phones, yeah, that was a big deal. First and foremost, I want to say after my second deployment in 1998, from 98 to 99, I feel like computers became a little bit more affordable, and because the phone lines were installed, all of a sudden everybody and their brother's uncle was going to the exchange to buy a desktop. Laptops weren't quite the rage yet. So desktop computers became really popular. It was not uncommon to go to a barracks room and find a desktop computer connected to the internet with AOL, the old dial-up, you know, whatever. Although back then, in the late 90s, even the early 2000s, meeting people off the internet was kind of because even back then, like as soon as the internet became a thing, like all of a sudden, like instantly, it was like the lies and the deception. But the internet wasn't quite where it was today. We didn't have that instant gratification communication. People, you know, people still weren't like filming things or whatnot, or, you know, information wasn't being passed as rapidly or as fast. So, like, for those of us that lived in the barracks, we didn't watch the news, all right? We didn't know what was going on in the, you know, world affairs, you know? I mean, we worked pretty damn hard. We often worked late, or what felt late. Then you had, if you were single, you had to get to the chow hall on time, eat, and then you probably went to the gym or something like that, and then by the time you were done with the gym, there was only so much time before you had to get to bed, because 5 o'clock, 5:30 rolls around pretty damn fast. Damn, that light is annoying. So with that being said, I noticed later in life, cell phones became a bigger and bigger issue. Not because, you know, but like you'd be in formation and somebody's cell phone would go off. And it always fascinated me, because it wasn't until later in my career that I'm like towards the end of my career, when I got closer to retirement, that maybe I had a cell phone on me. When I got my first cell phone in 2001, I used to turn it off and leave it in my vehicle, and I'd go to work. And then I would turn it on at the end of the day and check for messages or whatnot. So essentially, like when you had a landline at the house, you couldn't access your landline at work. People couldn't get a hold of you at work. And that's how I treated my cell phone, is if I was at work, you couldn't get a hold of me. That's just the way it was. I will admit, my grandmother, you know, God rest her soul, she would call me at extremely awkward times while I'm at work. I'm like, Grandma, what are you doing? I'm at work. I'm physically at work. I know there's a time difference. It's an hour, but I'm still at work. What are you doing? But there was nothing worse than, like, you'd be in a formation and, like, somebody important with high rank and whatever is talking or engaging the audience, and, you know, you'd get that dun, 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 whatever the hell it is, the ringtone. Social media, the only thing I can tell you about social media is, unfortunately, a lot of service members, I won't say younger service members, because I don't want to pigeonhole the young service members, but they were the largest demographic that were the worst offenders. People would be on social media and they'd be like, yeah, we're here at grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and here's exactly what we're doing with 15 guys, and here's all of our weapons. If you're not tracking, if you're not speaking the lingo, I mean, this is about as dumb could get. I mean, this is like, you know, there's dumb, and then there's like, are you trying really hard to prove yourself to be extra dumber? People in the service were misusing social media, not thinking of the potential consequences. Talked about the vehicles. Marriages weren't necessarily a big problem in Hawaii. It was not uncommon that some idiot would meet somebody, whether they knew him already from back home or met him on the island, and they would get married just so that they could get the hell out of the barracks. Getting married to get out of the barracks is nothing new in the military, and I don't think it'll ever change. I don't remember it being as big an issue in Hawaii, and maybe that's because we had a greater social life in Hawaii. I was never stationed in California other than the Mountain Warfare Training Center. Can't speak intelligently to that because I was already a senior Marine, so to speak. In Lejeune, I always had a handful of kids, all right, you know, teenagers that were legal adults that were married, and I've spoken about this numerous times, probably even on my channel, and it never failed. I always had marital issues I had to deal with as a leader of Marines. And I know the landscape has changed. I know society's changed quite a bit, but at least back in my day, prior to me retiring, the overwhelming majority, I would say 99.9% of what I dealt with was heterosexual marriages. And a lot of what I dealt with were cheating spouses. More so the wife cheating than the Marine, because it was a lot easier. Back then, it was a lot easier to hold the Marine accountable. But you know, you'd get some poor kid, and I realize people won't like the analogy, but you know, fuck it, don't watch this video. You get some kid who is from a little place, some flyover state, whatever. He's from a small town, you know, in some state where he's a big fish in a little pond, so he can marry the prom queen, right? So they get married, and he's her ticket out of middle of Nowheresville. He brings her here to Camp Lejeune, where there's 50, 60, I don't know, there's a lot of Marines, right? On his best day, he's probably a quarter pounder with cheese, and out of thousands of Marines here, there's steak on the menu, and he can't understand why his child bride will not honor the vows of marriage at 19. So that was a big deal. Money, I took down that note because I don't know if over the years we just got paid more. But when I see how the Marines spend their money versus how we spent our money, we couldn't afford to buy cars. There was a lot of stuff I feel like we could not afford to do. Like, we didn't have phone lines because we couldn't afford a phone line. We didn't have cable because privately we couldn't afford it, but maybe together we could afford cable, and you'd have to get it shut off if one of your roommates decided he didn't want to pay for it. So I feel like the service members must be getting paid a whole lot more, or things have become more cost effective, because I feel like service members I see nowadays have way more conveniences at a much younger age than we had access to when I was much younger. Mindset difference from the generations. If it affects society, then you can imagine it affects the services. If there's generational differences that you can physically measure in society, you can also measure that in the service as well. What I will say is, by and large, probably the better portion of society is trying to join the military. People with some semblance of a work ethic, people with some positive mindset try to join the military. However, and I'm not trying to bag on the military. I'm not trying to let some massive secret out of the bag, but not everybody joins the military to make themselves better, or if they did, if that was their original intent, not everybody allows the military to make a positive change. And that's not a generational thing. That's universal. From my time in the service, people before me, people after me, some people may have intended to change for the better by joining the military, but then once exposed to other people who think alike, you know, they just go back to being what they were. I will say that as far as different mindsets go, it's hard to maybe quantify certain things, but I could definitely see a change in the mindset. Whether it's because of how society is. I graduated high school before Common Core was a thing. Pro and con, good or bad, I graduated before Common Core. I was taught cursive. All right. So as you can imagine, whatever changes you're seeing in society, it's also happening in the military, because those people that are part of society are also joining the military, so you're seeing it as well. Unfortunately, military leaders that wear stars on their collar, you know, the joke is that they become politicians. Well, they do because they get approved to wear a star on their collar by politicians. You can get promoted all the way up to colonel without politicians. After that, politicians, elected officials, have to confirm you for 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4 stars. For crying out loud, politicians like John McCain got so pissed off that a 3-star and a 4-star general made more than an entry-level congressman that he somehow got a bill passed that general officers cannot get paid any more than the 2-star level. Whatever. Positive and negative adaptations. That goes hand in hand with society. Sometimes we make excessive corrections, we overcorrect. Sometimes we make positive corrections. I think every time the military does try to make positive adaptations, there are some negative consequences and side effects. I don't agree with certain things. I hear all kinds of horror stories. I hear horror stories about whether it's females making allegations against males, whether it's people from the LGBTQIA+ community making allegations against heterosexuals, whether it's non-whites. So I guess because if you're non-white, then you get to wear the banner of being a minority, making allegations against whites, where what I can tell you is people are people, and people will try to take advantage of any advantages provided. What I used to love about the military is the military had a basic sniff test, where if it smells like bullshit, chances are it's bullshit. And the vast majority of commanders were not so woke or socially sensitive that they would allow themselves to smell the bullshit and be like, this smells like bullshit, I'm not taking this serious. So I don't know how true some of these horror stories are that I hear. You know, in the whole reason for the this video was because of Andrea Gallagher being on oh crap, that podcast with Marcus Luttrell and his wife. And the whole reason they're popular is because Eddie Gallagher was allegated against by a couple of sailors from his SEAL team that basically just didn't like him. And they got so deep with their allegations that it was either, you know, pull the ripcord and be like, man, we didn't expect it to go this far, or just dig in deep. And they dug in deep. So, uniforms, yes, pre and post 9/11. Leave it to the Marine Corps to be the one to lead the charge on changing the uniforms. I would have to say this was a force negative, because what it ended up doing is every branch of service had to eventually adapt to this, and so now every branch of service looks completely different in the battle uniform. utility uniform, camouflage uniform. It used to be I could go to the Navy exchange, the Army exchange, the Air Force exchange, and I can find a pair of boots, or I can find a pair of camouflage trousers or a camouflage blouse if I couldn't find them at my exchange, because we all wore the same camouflage uniform. We just put different emblems on it. We just put different rank insignias on it. That was it. We used to have to, since we did that, we used to have to iron the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor on our left breast pocket. And then, of course, name tapes. Name tapes were 2 years old when I joined the service. I think October of 1992 is when name tapes became a thing. Basically, your branch of service was here, and your last name was right here. MARSOC. MARSOC was a post 9/11 change. My cousin's in MARSOC. I've got some friends that were MARSOC. I got friends that got drafted into MARSOC. The thing that I didn't understand originally is prior to that we had recon and force recon. These guys were pretty high speed, low drag. These guys were some quote unquote badass motherfuckers. Been to a lot of special operational schools, you know, had all the quote unquote special operational, you know, qualifications under their belt. Just back when they formed Special Operations Command, the Commandant of the Marine Corps decided, you know what, no, I want to keep Marines Marines. I don't want to go through a divorce where, you know, now mom marries SOCOM, that's the stepdad, and most of the time the kids go with mom and dad gets visitation, right? So that was one of the best examples I ever heard. So I don't quite understand why Marine Special Operations Command just didn't, you know, absorb recon and force recon into MARSOC without, instead of creating an entirely new structure, basically reinventing the wheel. Now, some of the guys that are in MARSOC will probably disagree and have some comments, and that's fine. It's not my world. It's not my community. I won't pretend to know. But I got some buddies that got drafted into MARSOC based on their service record book, and they lived through some jackassery. When MARSOC stood up, for anybody who doesn't know, when MARSOC stood up, you had the recon guys, the force recon guys, and then you had the non-recon guys. And they tried to keep some level of separation, but not always did they do that. And then they didn't blend well together, because the force recon guys were like, we're force recon, and then the recon guys were like, well, we're better than not being recon, and then the non-recon guys were like, dude, I'm just here. So there were some growing pains, which is why I didn't understand why it was done that way. But MARSOC's come a long way. It's got its own training program. I think they're almost at the point right now where all of that, not because if I was still in and I was too old for MARSOC and I didn't get the draft, I'd be at 28 going on 29 years. So is it possible there's still some guys that are my age, from my generation, that are still lingering? It's possible. But, you know, triangle has limited room at the top, or a pyramid has limited room at the top, right? Barack Obama, my views, particularly on sexual preference. You know, personally, as I got older, I didn't care so much about your sexual preference, because, quite frankly, when it comes to the physical performance of the job, you know, and I mean everything, showing up on time, having a proper haircut, having a proper shave, a clean, presentable uniform. Because, you know, one of the other negatives of this uniform thing is we used to have to polish our boots. Now we have boots you don't polish, so they could look like shit. We weren't allowed to have boots that looked like shit. We had to press out our camouflage uniform in garrison. They don't do that anymore. So now if the uniform looks crummy, it just looks crummy. So there are certain things that have nothing to do with sexual preference. Quite frankly, sexual preference is an off-the-clock sort of thing. Who you choose to be intimate with, who you want to be physically intimate with. So I don't really care about that. Barack Obama, he had an opportunity to be a really good president. He had an opportunity to do some really good things. And I think when some of those critical opportunities presented themselves, whether he did it on purpose, whether he got bad advice, whatever the case may be, I think he made some critical mistakes that we are ultimately paying for now. I think some of the choices he made, some of the decisions he made are having some long, lingering negative consequences. I'll just leave it at that. What else do I got here? Military requires a singular focus, not what's socially trendy. Yeah, that goes back to the whole generals and whatnot and politicians. The military does need to have a singular focus, and I feel like prior to 9/11 and even within, say, 10 years after 9/11, even though we were well into Obama's first term, I would say that we started to lose focus during Obama's second term, especially when he did away with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now, personally, I don't care. I really don't. But I don't see what business it is of anybody's your sexual preference. And quite frankly, from where I sit, it seems like once they took away the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the people that are gay, it seems like they have to go out of their way to tell you that they're gay. Well, my husband or my wife, let me tell you, by the time this conversation's over, I'm going to let you know I've got a wife as a female 17 times in the span of 10 minutes. Just in case you didn't get it the first 16 times, or vice versa. I've got a husband, and over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to mention that at least 13 times in case the first 12 don't sink in. And it's kind of like, I get it. You're gay. I don't care. And I don't care. I don't care. Positively, negatively, I don't care how you take it. I don't care. Can you do your job? I had a female captain who was a helicopter pilot. I don't care that she's gay. Fly the helicopter. Land the helicopter. If you can do that, I don't care who you go home to. I don't care that you scissor. I don't care. If you can effectively do your job and not crash the helicopter while there's Marines in the back, who fucking cares? Who cares? But, there's been some consequences of that. The military being the experimental playground of, politics. Tragically, it's been happening for years. It'll never stop happening. I just think that the politicians need to keep in mind that if they're going to experiment, the experiment has to be military-minded. All right? I'm not saying I'm justifying the experiments. I'm saying you need to keep in mind the military has to have a singular focus. And it's not wokeness. It's not social justice. I mean, there's a reason why all branches of service are not meeting their recruiting quotas. Because the type of people that want to join the military don't want to join this military. At least not while fucking Joe Biden's in office. I still can't believe 81 million people actually voted for, hey, ba-da-ba-da, ba-ba-da-ba-da. And that your son's a known drug addict. Cocaine's found in the White House. The most secure house in America. And nobody knows who it belongs to. Nobody. I'll tell you, if you're my generation, here's a joke you might get. Perhaps if Joe or Jill would have gotten Hunter a Pepsi, maybe he wouldn't have done drugs. Food for thought. Duty station differences, cookie cutter, almost bankable to where we're at now. Yeah, I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. So, I can't speak to the differences in the duty stations prior to 9/11. I mean, other than geography, I can't speak to, whether or not Lejeune had more issues with young Marines having access to vehicles due to the proximity of where they live from Lejeune. I don't know if that's always been an issue where You know, everybody's always been 10 hours or less from Lejeune, so getting their vehicles, I don't know. I don't know if marriages have always been a problem, you know, prior to me getting stationed there. I don't know. I thought I was going to get stationed in Camp Pendleton, and I didn't even know Hawaii was a duty station. And then I got my orders to Hawaii right before I graduated SOI. Had no idea what to expect. Everything when we had our little fireside chats on what to expect, you know, boat company, helo company, track company, getting onto a MEU, being a BLT, you know, all these things, right? I get to Hawaii and it's like, what's that? We don't do any of that. If we're lucky, we'll fly on one kind of helicopter because we've only got one. We don't have all of them here. All right, we have Pearl Harbor, but we'll never go there for anything because we've got no reason to go there. So, you know, that experience was completely different. That being said, having talked to some people, like one of the guys I work with was stationed in Camp Pendleton, specifically 5th Marines, and he loves talking about the massive difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. I will say, when I first got here, and I did talk about this numerous times previously, when I first got here as a 10-year sergeant, which admittedly was already unique. I should have been a staff sergeant, but anyways, the way that they treated sergeants, I don't know if that was unit specific, I don't know if that was 2nd Marine Division specific, if that was Lejeune specific, but it was not what I expected. I feel like in a pre-9/11 world, maybe even a little bit post-9/11, there was a very predictable cycle. When I was in Hawaii, when I first got there, there was only 3 battalions. We were 6 on, 12 off. You'd go to Oki for 6, you'd come back for 12. There was only room in Hawaii for 2 battalions. Somebody always had to be deployed. So we would do 6 to Oki, 12 back in Hawaii. Then I was part of the first unit that got deployed for 7 months. So we would do 7 months, come back for 14. Everybody else, everywhere else, was doing a 6 and 18. So they would deploy for 6 months, come back to the States for 18. You know, so there was a predictability. There was, you know, a level of predictability. I don't know if that predictability is back or not. Now that we're pretty much outside the post 9/11 world, I've been retired. I don't know. Have there been some positive changes to come from Iraq and Afghanistan? Have there been some lessons learned? I'm sure there are. I don't want to sit here and list them because I'm going for about 37 minutes. But I can tell you, and I mentioned this before, we used to joke that we need war because all this stupid jackassery will go away. The stupid jackassery we were dealing with may have gone away, but it was replaced by something else. I'll give you an example. There was this $1 million camera system that would go like 100 feet in the sky, and it would allow you to look out, because in Afghanistan it was wide open spaces, and the enemy was really good at shooting at distance and setting in these IEDs that were just homemade explosives that were designed to basically pick vehicles up and throw them, or there were landmines. So, you know, we would use these camera systems as recon. Well, certain leaders were using it to basically babysit Marines on patrol. You know, they're worn out. They're, you know, towards the 3/4 mark. Who is calling me and why? Don't know you. So you got these Marines that are just getting burnt out, you know, risking their lives. You know, some of their buddies, they had to medevac with injuries. Some of their buddies, they had to evac, for, you know, because they were killed in action. You know, these guys are worn out, and there's some guy taking advantage of this camera system. You know, oh, you're not wearing the uniform correctly. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And it's like, where's this? Where, you know. So, you know, the stupidity and the jackassery will never go away. It'll just change. And Mike, that's directly for you and anybody else that's watching. The biggest thing I'd have to say is, as far as where we are now, a lot of us joined during peace, and for those of us that stayed in, we made a decent career during peace, shooting paper, shooting plastic. Some of us did okay. Some of us did better than okay when we were actually faced with a real enemy that really wanted to fight. Some of us didn't. I'm not afraid to admit it. Some of us did not. I'd like to think that I at least did my job and earned my paycheck. I don't want to say that I was the bee's knees, that I am the textbook of bravery or whatnot. I'd like to think I at least faked it enough to look like I was competent, but I don't want to vouch for myself. I will say that some of the people I did watch were embarrassing failures. You have a large population of service members that were baptized by fire as PFCs. They were battle-born, battle-bred. You know, some of them are getting ready to retire now. I mean, do the math. If you joined in 2003, you could retire with 20 years right now. All right? By 2003, we were in Iraq. All right? We were already in Afghanistan. So it's entirely possible that by 2003, you could have been a war-born young trooper who's now getting ready to retire, and if for no other reason, because you're having a hard time adjusting to a Marine Corps that's not in combat anymore. And then vice versa, the guys that joined later, like one of my coworkers that joined later, he would probably still have 5 or 6 years left before he could hit a full 20. He got medically retired, but if he was still in, he'd have like 5 or 6 years till he hit a full 20. And just listening to him talk, he's a good dude, but I don't know if he could handle the modern day Marine Corps right now. Some of the guys that did like 10 years in the service where it was nothing but combat rotations, they're not having an easy time with this non-combat lifestyle. So with that being said, I've been going for over 40 minutes. I'm going to have to call that a conclusion. I'm going to say that concludes my little spiel on pre and post 9/11. Any future videos that I try and get done from this point forward will, on this channel, if I don't invent a new channel for my nerdy or geeky stuff, this channel I'll still maintain for socio-political stuff. Stace, here's what I'll tell you. If you're watching this, if you just say, wow, nice video, that my bread and butter is reading and reacting and responding to comments. So if you just say, hey, nice information, doesn't give me much to respond to, and I'm sorry that it took so long. Mike, as you know, if you see this and you listen to it, I always love your feedback. Anybody else, I'm not in this for monetization, so if you leave a comment, I promise I will read, react, and respond. Your voice will be heard, and that's kind of what I'm doing here. So with that being said, you're awesome. Be safe out there. Till next time.